I will add a new folder and name it context, and you can name it whatever you want. That of course does not matter. And in there, I'll add a off-context.js file. In here, I'll create a so-called context object, and React gives us access to that. So we need to import React from React. And then I'll create my off context here by calling React create context. And I'll export this off context as a default for this file. Now, React create context actually allows us to initialize our context with a default value, because what the context in the end is a globally available JavaScript object, you could say. Though globally available is not entirely correct, you decide where it is available. But it is a JavaScript object that can be passed between React components without using props, behind the scenes, so to say. So you can initialize this with any value you want. For example, here I'll set authenticated to false. And I'll also add a login method here. However, this method will not do anything. It's an empty anonymous function. And I'm adding this here because if I initialize my default value with everything I want to be able to access on this context from different components in my application, then I actually get better auto-completion from the IDE. And that's the only reason. And I don't really care too much about that default value here otherwise, because now that off context will be used in app.js. And I will show you how to use it there and why it doesn't matter what you set as a default value. So in there, let's import off context with a capital A at the beginning from the context folder. And there, of course, the off-context file. Now, off context can be used as a component. And it should wrap, and that's important, it should wrap all the parts of your application that need access to this context. In my case, it will be the cockpit component and the persons component, which I output down there. So this part here needs to be wrapped by my context. This button doesn't really care, and if I had other components being rendered in here and they don't need authentication information, then they also don't need to be wrapped. So down here, I will use my off context, which I imported now, as a JSX element, but not like this, but instead here you can access with a dot provider. So this actually gives you a provider JSX component on this off context object. And you wrap everything where you want to be able to access this context later on. So now inside of the cockpit and of persons, we'll be able to interact with our context. And also in the app.js file, because here I'm setting up this provider component. Now the provider, this component, takes a value prop. And this is why the default values here don't really matter. The default value will apply when you don't set any other value. However, in many use cases like this one, you actually want to have a dynamic value. The authentication status can change after all. And therefore, I'll manage the status here in app.js, and I pass my current state of the authentication status here to value. So value will be a JavaScript object, hence the double curly braces. Outer curly braces are there to enter dynamic content. Inner curly braces construct a JavaScript object. And there I'll have the exact same structure as here in the default context object. So I'll have authenticated and login as keys. And again, I did set it up here in my off context initialization because this now gives me better auto completion in my IDE. So in app.js, in this object here, we now have this authenticated key here, and this should refer to this state authenticated. So we'll still manage the authentication status in my state of this component, because one thing does not change when you use context. React will re-render when state or props change. So only changing something in a context object would not cause a re-render cycle, and therefore this is not enough. Hence, I still manage my authentication status in the state of this component, but I then also store the current state in that authenticated prop of the object I'm passing as a value to the off context. And since this effectively is a prop of the off context provider, this will update whenever this state updates. Now we also have the login key, and that should point at my login handler. So this just stores a reference to this login handler function. Now this is in my context object that can now be accessed from cockpit and persons because they are inside of the provider wrapper. So let's now access this inside of persons. How can we get access to our off context here? First of all, we have to import it again. So import off context with a capital A from, and then you go up to the context folder and then off context. And now here, we don't want to provide the context, but we want to consume it. And you do this by going to the place where you return your JSX code, where you want to use that context. And then you simply use offContext.consumer as a JSX component. And this now wraps your other JSX code. Since this is some JavaScript expression, we need to wrap this here with curly braces. So now here we have offContext.consumer, but this is not yet the entirely correct syntax. offContext.consumer does not take JSX code as a child, so as content between the opening and closing tag, but instead this takes a function as a child between the opening and closing tag. So here I actually will pass in a function which will eventually return my JSX code. And this function, which will be executed for us by the offContext.consumer or by the React Context API, this function will get our context object. So this is how we get access to that context object here in the place where we consume it. We provide a function that accepts context as an argument. We'll get that argument by the offContext here. React executes this function for us. And then in this JSX code, which we return here and which will be rendered in the end, we have access to that context object. And therefore now we could forward this to isOff. But of course that was not the idea here, right? We wanted to use the off context in person, not in persons. We wanted to skip that extra cycle where we have to forward something which we don't need in this component. So let's actually not consume off context in here. Let's remove that instead. And let's also remove the isOff prop we're forwarding. And let's remove the off context import. We wanted to use off context in the person component. So here is the place where we should import it. So import off context from, and now go all the way up to the context folder and import off context. And now here I want to set up my consumer in the place where I want to access that context data. And for me, that is this single line here. And if you needed it in other places, you would wrap everything with that consumer where you need it. So here I'll use my consumer. And as you learned, in there you get a function which gets context as an argument. And then you have to return the JSX code you eventually want to return. So here I will grab this check here where I render a paragraph. And now I can use my context here. So I now use context authenticated. With that, we're consuming our context in the person component to output the right data, but we're not using it for making this login button work. So let's go back to the cockpit component now, where we have that login button, and let's consume context here as well. So first of all, let's import off context from context off context. And then let's consume it here to wrap our login button. So here I will use off context consumer, wrap this entire button. But of course, as you learned, we don't just wrap the JSX code. Instead, we wrap a function where we get the context argument, and then this function returns the JSX code. And then again here, we cannot access, or we could access props login, but we don't want to. Instead, now we access context.login because remember that login property holds a reference to the login function. That is what we're setting up here. And now we don't need to pass this login handler on the login prop to cockpit anymore. Instead, we're now using context. And now once everything saves, we can press login and it updates as before, but now we're using the context API. And this is especially useful if you have very long chains of data you're passing around. And if you don't want to pass data from component to component to component, if you don't need it in these in-between components, then context is a great way of bypassing components and directly passing data from A to D.